Okay, so as we are shifting from the Section 5 and thinking of that of how property comes into existence and the idea that America was a blank canvas, that we begin with John Locke, and you're running through the sections that I laid out for you, really specifying on how government comes into existence and when the specific institutions that are being built. But one thing that John Locke goes back to when he's talking about property is thinking about laying out that vision that became so influential and by many others and those who enacted, the force of violence in acquiring the territories over the natives, and that idea of them backwards and savage was you must make use of the land, right? Yes, people live there, but they're not making use of it. So if they're not making use of it for the good of all, meaning the making of private property, shifting from the communal or open land that existed, and we're not idealizing native societies at all. What we're doing right now is just simply using it as a didactic tool to think about how property would come into being from those ideas that it was a blank slate, right? And if there are people on that territory, they aren't doing anything with the land. Therefore, it must be exploited, meaning resources must be extracted from the earth that was given to all, but it wasn't intended to remain for all forever, according to John Locke, and utilizing the idea of God to justify or rationalize that being, right? Whatever way we want to take it. So the whole ground of this nascent form of capitalism in this age of mercantilism meaning with the states coming in and protecting their own national charters over other empires and territories, but that we can trace to the present form of capitalism emanates from this period, right? So property has to be central if we're thinking about building this constitution. And now when we're thinking about how in the final section, in section 19 on the dissolution of government, that the reason why men enter into society is precisely to protect their property, right? To protect their property. And this is very central today when we're thinking about in our contemporary society, how that exists and the tensions that exist where maybe monopolies have been created, and how do we reconcile the exploitation of the masses of people on earth, not only in the United States. So the question that was taken upon by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, again a social contract theorist who wrote the social contract, his idea of theorizing in a more democratic vein, so to speak, of how society ought to be formed, driven by the general will. How do we come to that consensus? So we think about Thomas Hobbes. For us to consent to be governed, we're governed by an idea of an authoritarian figure, right? We are ruled over. We are told what to do. As long as we are safe and secure in our person and our property, we're okay with it. Move on to John Locke. For John Locke, the idea is it's not that bad. We establish a representative form of government. People are pretty good overall, right? We're thinking about nature, the essence of being what a human is. So for John Locke, it is a pretty optimistic view, but yet things happen. So we elect our representative, we build the institutions, and things will function very, very, very fine. So the idea of now that, and the question that is posed to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss-born French theorist, we put him in that school of French philosophers, who was born in Geneva in the 18th century. What's the origins of inequality, right? And here I have his tomb where he's entombed at the Pantheon in Paris. That's one of their very influential thinkers, right? And that really helped inspire what the actions of the French Revolution that would commence in 1789 on the heels of the American Revolution. And this is a moment of upheaval globally as a new world is being remade based on these ideas of these thinkers, right? And we've mentioned the influence of Thomas Jefferson from John Locke, and now during the French Revolution, now Thomas Jefferson is in Paris, is in France, along with other American revolutionaries such as Thomas Paine. Um, and one of the famous passages, not on in the second discourse here, but from the social contract, coming from Rousseau, is that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Yet everywhere he is in chains. So, and I have my dogs barking over here. Just excuse me for a minute. So, one of the, I guess I got excited listening to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. And what is meant by this passage is thinking about how, and consider this from this moment, right? How we're thinking, or have we ever been free? You're born, we are all born into a particular moment by chance. We're brought into this material world, but we're born into a world that is already constructed for us. The rules, the names of everything is laid out for us. The institutions, the syllabus is constructed for us, right? What does freedom mean? What does being free actually mean? Well, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau in this moment, he recognized that we enter free, but immediately something happens, right? There are those rules that we are bound by, and we did not consent to them, right? Just like none of us consented to the U.S. Constitution that was ratified back in 1789 that still preserves our nation state. But for John Locke would say you do consent by being born within that territory, utilizing the roads, the utilities, and the resources upon that within that territory. So this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who takes a more critical, really critical perspective on the structures of how the government comes into being and how it structures inequality. Just for example, the U.S. Constitution again, right? And I keep using the U.S. Constitution because that's our Constitution and that we can all reference. To think about the U.S. Constitution at the moment it was ratified structured inequality, and as I mentioned previously, it even made human beings property to be protected by their white master, or not even their masters, but just those white citizens in that territory, in the U.S. nation state. And this is the question that was laid out. He won the contest from the Academy of Dijon. What is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? So thinking through that vein of natural law, or the laws of nature that you've carried through in John Locke, right? So this is the question. And again, these folks, these thinkers are reading, they're well read. They've read the classics. They're reading what you're reading. That's why we're reading them, because there's a trajectory of ideas that are building institutions, building political power in our moment. And those ideas continue to inform, these ideas continue to inform power making in our present, right? And as you read, once people are accustomed to masters, they are no longer able to do without them. How accustomed are we to think of a two-party system? Two parties, right? How democratic is that? Not at all, right? But yet we are accustomed in a U.S. society, educated through a system, public school or even private school system, where the air that we breathe, the curriculum, going back to thinking about Paulo Freire, the role of education, or Plato's role of education was to socialize us, to make us become accustomed and comfortable with two people on a platform telling us who to vote for. We're really not a real big choice, right? Although in this moment, that's debatable. And then think of living without them, right? Think of having no institutions of power, or in society there are calls for the abolition of police. And can we imagine being without them? We are so accustomed to them, even if we see them doing something not so moral or ethical. So when we're thinking about, when Jean-Jacques Rousseau begins to think how inequality comes into being, he points out the two sorts of inequality, the natural and the physical, and then the moral and political. right? That shift from the concept of the savage man and civil man. And one big concept that we get that Jean-Jacques Rousseau never really lays out or names is that idea of the noble savage, right? So thinking about, he speaks of the Carib, the ideas of those people in the Caribbean, the travelers' tales that had already penetrated the minds of Europeans, told by those adventurers who had begun to tell stories of the people who inhabited the Americas, right? I mean, beginning in 1492. So, what are these differences, and how does that passage from the state of nature to the civil state? He says produces a very remarkable change in man by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct. So this is where Rousseau is really kind of portraying an idyllic state in some of those in the Carib, what he refers to the Carib. But before we get into that, I wanted to read this from page 9 in the PDF I provided you, where he's pointing back to that the people that we are reading, right? Hobbes and Locke and the other social contract theorists amongst them, is the philosophers who have inquired into the foundations of society have all felt the necessity of going back to a state of nature, but not one of them has got there. Some of them have not hesitated to ascribe to man in such a state the idea of just and unjust, without troubling themselves to show that he must be possessed of such an idea, or that it could be of any use to him. So others have spoken of the natural right of every man to keep what belongs to him. Think of property. How does one acquire property? Through our labor, and it's in our natural right, without explaining what they meant by belongs. Others, again, beginning by giving the strong authority over the weak, proceeded directly to the birth of government. Should all sound familiar. Without regard to the time that must have elapsed before the meaning of the words authority and government could have existed among men. Every one of them, in short, constantly dwelling on wants, avidity, oppression, desires, and pride, has transferred to the state of nature ideas which were acquired in society. So think of that. As Hobbes told us that all men are bad, therefore they will kill each other if they exist in the state of nature in this governmentless or anarchical world. Well, Rousseau's telling us, Hobbes, you were actually describing civil society, not that state of nature. Right? So to begin with, you can't take us to where you took us to from there. Right? So then, speaking of the savage, they describe the social men. Men, humans today for us, right, is thinking that we are all social creatures. Nowhere more evident than in our moment, where people are feeling not having that connection to other human beings, right? Some people do it we are doing it for our safety, our health, and we are feeling it, literally, because we need other human beings. We need to be in the classroom, connecting, talking to each other, engaging, going out and socializing. And so we are social creatures. So going back to this idea about the state of nature has not even entered into the heads of most of our writers to doubt whether the state of nature ever existed. The state of nature is, again, a tool, a mechanism to make us think about how we enter consent into being governed. If we are painted a horrible picture, Rousseau's telling us, we will run to our chains. Right? For Locke, it is property primarily why we need a government. Right? And again, he points to those things that Rousseau critiques as, hey, Hobbes and John Locke, you are both describing civil society, not that state of nature. Right? You're describing men as you see them, maybe superficially or acting in the world, maybe exceptions to the norm. And now you're attempting to build a theory to construct institutions that will affect people for our moment here. Right? So when he says that, he affirms that the state of reflection is a state contrary to nature, and that the man who mediates is a depraved animal. Right? So reflecting, as you're reading this, as you're reading Rousseau, the reflection upon that building, the avarice attempts begins to corrupt men and develop ideas